Hey friends, welcome back to our videos. We're going to talk today about community building. It's something that has looked a little different this year, and some parts of it that we found are really, really essential that we keep with us going forward.
Yeah. As I was thinking about this topic, as always, sometimes we struggle to come up with a little bit of like a story that kind of shows what we're getting at when we choose these topics. And one of the things that came to mind for me was thinking back to our Wednesday night supper and soul work um, program that we had pre-pandemic. And often we would have a group of adults who would sit in the social hall and play board games with one another. And our programming that we had with children was sort of like separate from that, but in the same space. And we would invite them to do like a little circle gathering and maybe do a craft, something like that. And something on this particular day unexpected had happened where a couple of our kids decided they wanted to join the board game that the adults were having. I think it was Scrabble that day, but I was just so tickled as I watched this unfold as the adults sort of like they shifted what they were doing to make sure that they could include the kids, some of which who couldn't really read yet, and they're a Scrabble game, and they did what they could to involve the kids in a way that everybody just felt lovely about, right? They had a really good time and the kids were just so excited to play with these adults that they didn't really know well. And these adults seemed really happy and pleased to be playing with these kids that they didn't really know well. Um, and going forward from that day, I don't know, it just felt like we connected in a different way, even if we were just occupying the same space again and not really interacting with the same activity. It just seemed to shift the mood a little bit of that whole gathering. It was a really lovely to watch.
And it's such a clear example of community building, of just like already having a game there ready to go and not really having to like get rid of that game completely or like throw everything out, but just adding another chair to the table, maybe just widening that circle a little bit, including people in, and then changing the rules a little bit, changing the covenant of that group, of maybe not focusing so much on the Scrabble game. So the goal is no longer to win Scrabble. The goal is now to connect with other people through Scrabble. And it would have been so easy to just kind of brush off the kids and say like, oh, we're just playing a game and have fun over there. But that beautiful moment of welcoming people in and not diminishing the importance of the Scrabble game, just finding a way to make that circle whole. And it's our understanding of how to do that and how to build community has changed so much and will continue to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mentioned right up at the top too that like it was, a challenge to come up with a story. And I think part of that is because I think some of the things that come to mind immediately when we talk about community building can be some of the times where maybe it didn't work so well. Like you mentioned, it would have been so easy for it not to turn out that way. And I think we can all maybe look back on experiences that each of us have maybe had where maybe we were kind of, shooed away from the table. No, you can't play this. We've already started or whatever. And, those often are experiences that really, really stick with us. And so it's nice to be able to think of experiences where we see it go so seamlessly and so well. And to lift those up is like, see, this is totally possible to expand our circle, expand our covenants, expand our understanding of what this community at the table is right now by just, like you said, adding a chair and being open-hearted about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like even before we even get to that, what's a good example, just the naming of community building is important. Just saying that is really important, because we have to name what's there in front of us before we can do anything with it. And so, naming and defining in some kind of way what community building is, like we're doing right now, it helps us know what we're working for before we try to then figure out, okay, so what do we do to try and work for it? defining it. And again, that's always changing, and it's important to check in with that of what does that mean? Why is it important? And we have the clearest example of needing to check in on what community building is in virtual times now, and we'll need to check in with it again when we're back in person together. That definition is going to be a little bit different, and at the core, very much the same, I think.
Yeah. And even, you and I have this conversation a lot too, when we're talking about how we're doing religious education here at WBUC, and what we are showing that we value by how we spend our time in classes, right? We've made the decision to show that community is at the center of our work, right? That we can't be intentional Unitarian Universalists without naming community building as a value, and working through that by being in right relationship and showing that in our covenant with one another. And in fact, I talk about James Luther Adams a lot. He, in his work, says that as liberal religious people, our job is to be in relationships of our choosing, in communities by choice, right? And then to work for justice together, and to learn, and to learn new things, and to be constantly working for justice within those communities, and keeping our eyes out, like making sure that we are in right relationship, asking that question, who are we in right relationship with, and how can we widen the circle in this community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a phrase that we see around church a lot is grow your soul and serve the world. And I think that's what you're speaking to a lot is you have to do that internal work of growing your soul first before going out and serving the world. Have to get your own ducks in the row. But that doesn't mean it happens alone, right? That means it happens in a reflective way that then goes out farther. And so it's something we can do now, right, is figure out, growing our souls, what does it mean to build community? That's this work, so that sometime we will actually do those things. And it makes me think of things like book clubs, where it can be so easy to say, I read the book, I learned the thing, I talked about it with my 5 other people in my book club, period, end of story. That's kind of where the stuff stops. And to me, that's different from growing your soul. That's not quite what that is. To me, growing your soul involves connecting with other people. It's not an individual thing. It's vulnerable. It's scary. Mistakes happen, and people get hurt. And that's a risk that we take. And that's also how we connect with each other. To walk up to a Scrabble table with adults there, for a kid to walk up to a Scrabble table with adults that you don't know, that's a risk. That is brave to walk up there and say, what are you doing? Can I join? That's huge. And to be able to take that risk, that's the only way that communities form. And it can be really comfortable to stay in the pages of a book and a set of discussion questions and people that I know really, really well. But it's not going to grow the soul and serve the world in the way that we really, really need it to for this conversation.
Right. Yeah, and even having the imagination beyond the rules that came with the Scrabble box, so that it can be more inclusive, that takes risks too. It requires you to imagine, right? Mm-hmm. I think especially for adults, sometimes that feels risky. I think kids live in that world of imagination so much that maybe they can imagine sometimes easier that community can look different than how they've always experienced it. Yeah, it's risk, and being willing to lean into that. I think one of the questions you and I get a lot from parents are for resources, help the kids in their lives understand X, Y, or Z topic. And I love providing those resources. I think they can be extremely helpful. But what I also always tell parents is that what is going to make the most difference with these resources is that you're available, that you're open to questions, that you're an askable parent. We have a pamphlet about that we often give out to our OWL parents, being an askable parent. And I think that taking that risk of vulnerability, of availability, is much different than just reading the resources and having them. If you don't do anything with it, you've gained nothing. Nobody has, you've not built that relationship or that community. And it's not the information itself that's valuable, right? It's that relationship that comes out of it that's valuable. And so your example about the book club is a perfect one, right? One of the questions we invite our children to ask, and we discuss together after we read a story, is what is this story calling you to do? And I'll ask that question. What is this book club experience calling me to do? What is this resource calling me to do? And then doing it, right? That's the serve your world piece of that. We've grown our souls by allowing us to be cracked open, to have our understandings shifted. But maybe the real growth happens when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to imagine that we can now behave differently in the world because of that experience.
So we'd love to hear from you all, to share with us in what ways are you building community? How is that showing up for you? And back to that question of what is this conversation calling you to do in that? So we'd love to hear from you. You can email us or comment below, and we'll be back again next week.